What happens when the most underestimated person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous? This is the story of Gladys Smith, a 47-year-old woman whose quiet demeanor and simple appearance masked secrets that would bring down one of the most prestigious institutions in America. They thought they knew who she was. They were wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to the coastline of Monterey, California, as Gladys Smith adjusted the rearview mirror of her modest Honda Civic. At 47, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, secured with a drugstore hair tie, and her clothes faded navy slacks, sensible walking shoes, and a cream-colored cardigan that had seen better years spoke of someone who shopped at outlet stores and clipped coupons. She sat in the parking lot of the Monterey Culinary Institute, watching through her windshield as expensive cars deposited their passengers at the entrance. BMW sedans, Tesla Model S vehicles, and the occasional Porsche SUV delivered men and women dressed in designer chef coats, their knife rolls crafted from Italian leather, and their culinary equipment worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Monterey Culinary Institute wasn't just any cooking school. It was the most exclusive culinary academy on the West Coast, where celebrity chefs sent their protégés and where Michelin-starred restaurants recruited their future kitchen leaders. The waiting list was 2 years long, the tuition rivaled that of Harvard Medical School, and the graduation rate hovered around 30%. Students didn't just learn to cook here, they learned to command kitchens that could make or break restaurant empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Gladys reached for her worn canvas knife bag on the passenger seat. Unlike the sleek cases carried by her fellow students, hers looked like it had survived several decades of hard use. The canvas was faded and patched in places, held together by careful stitches that spoke of someone who couldn't afford to replace things when they broke. Inside, her knives were a mismatched collection, some with wooden handles worn smooth by countless hands, others with blades that showed the patina of age and constant sharpening. They weren't pretty, but they had served her well for longer than she cared to remember. The registration lobby of the Institute was a temple to culinary excellence. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, and the walls were lined with photographs of famous alumni alongside their James Beard Awards and Michelin stars. Glass cases displayed artifacts from legendary kitchens: a whisk used by Julia Child, a cleaver that had belonged to Jacques Pepin, and a set of copper pots that had once graced the kitchen of Le Bernardin. At the reception desk stood a young woman whose nameplate read Madison Parker. She couldn't have been more than 23, with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that looked like it had been applied by a professional. Her chef's coat was pristine white and pressed to perfection, with creases so sharp they could have cut vegetables. When Gladys approached, Madison looked her up and down with the kind of expression usually reserved for something unpleasant that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. "Ma'am," Madison said, her voice carrying that particular blend of false sweetness and genuine condescension, "I think you might be looking for the community center cooking classes. Those are held about 15 minutes away, near the public library." Gladys set her knife bag on the marble counter with the same careful deliberation she used for everything else. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said quietly, sliding her enrollment confirmation across the polished surface. The document bore the official seal of the Institute and several signatures that would have impressed Madison if she'd known enough to recognize their importance. Madison scanned the paperwork with growing confusion. The authorization codes were legitimate, but this woman didn't look like the typical MCI student. Most of them arrived wearing chef coats that cost more than Madison's car payment, carrying knife sets that had been featured in culinary magazines. They spoke in rapid-fire conversations about molecular gastronomy, sous vide techniques, and which restaurants in Copenhagen We're currently pushing the boundaries of Nordic cuisine. Kitchen 7 is available for the practical examination, Madison said finally, handing over a temporary access card. Just, please be careful with the equipment. Some of those appliances cost more than most people make in a year. Gladys nodded and made her way through corridors lined with portraits of culinary legends. The main teach-in kitchen was a cathedral of stainless steel and cutting-edge technology. 40 individual cooking stations stretched across the space, each equipped with professional-grade ranges, convection ovens, immersion circulators, and knife blocks filled with German steel that gleamed under the LED lighting. The air filtration system hummed quietly to clear any smoke or steam, and the temperature was precisely controlled to create optimal working conditions. It was here that she first encountered them. A group of 5 students clustered around stations. 15 through 19, their equipment spread out like a culinary supply catalog had exploded. They wore matching chef coats embroidered with the logo of the Platinum Spoon, one of the most exclusive restaurant groups in the country. Their knives were works of art, hand-forged Japanese blades that cost more than most people's monthly rent, each one perfectly balanced and sharp enough to slice through a tomato without bruising the flesh. The group's leader was immediately recognizable to anyone who followed the culinary world. James Wellington stood, 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that suggested he'd never missed a workout in his 32 years of life. His black hair was styled in a perfect undercut, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd built his career on eliminating competition. As the executive chef and co-owner of 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, he'd appeared on countless magazine covers and commanded cooking fees that rivaled those of rock stars. Well, well, Wellington's voice carried across the kitchen as Gladys set up at Station 7. Looks like someone's grandmother wandered away from the retirement home cooking class. His team erupted in laughter. There was Amanda Rodriguez, a former culinary school valedictorian whose knife skills were legendary among their graduating class. Next to her stood Tyler Thompson, whose molecular gastronomy techniques had been featured in Food and Wine magazine before he'd even graduated. Marcus Miller rounded out the group, a specialist in French classical techniques whose sauce work was so precise it looked like engineering. Gladys continued unpacking her equipment, methodically laying out her mismatched knives as if she hadn't heard a word. What emerged from her canvas bag drew even more mockery from Wellington's group. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez whistled loud enough for the entire kitchen to hear. Are those antiques? I think I saw knives like that in my grandmother's kitchen from the 1970s. My culinary school has a museum, Thompson added, adjusting his pristine chef's coat. Those might actually belong there instead of in a working kitchen. Gladys finally looked up from her preparations, her brown eyes meeting Wellington's stare directly. There was something in that gaze that made him pause, a depth that suggested she'd worked in kitchens that would make his Michelin-starred establishments look like children's playhouses. But the moment passed and his smirk returned. Ma'am, Wellington said with mock politeness, are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in one of the basic home cooking classes? What we're doing here requires a certain level of professional expertise. Gladys's response was quiet and steady, delivered with the kind of calm that experienced chefs recognized but couldn't quite place. I appreciate the concern, but I think I'll manage. As she spoke, she noticed something that the others had missed. A small group of other students had stopped their own prep work to watch the unfolding drama. Word was already spreading through the kitchen about the middle-aged woman who'd walked into the elite institute with antique knives and a confidence that seemed oddly out of place. Asterisk, the voice of Chef Patricia Summers, the institute's head instructor, crackled over the kitchen's intercom system. All students to your stations. Today's practical examination will test your knife skills, sauce preparation, and protein cookery. You have 3 hours to prepare a 3-course meal that demonstrates technical proficiency and creative vision. Best performance wins a stage position at Le Bernardin in New York City. Gladys felt a familiar calm settle over her as she approached. Station 7. It was the same feeling she'd experienced countless times before in competitions, in professional kitchens, and in places where the stakes were much higher than restaurant stages and culinary school bragging rights. She had no idea that within the next 3 hours, she would shatter every assumption these students had about her, reveal skills that had been hidden for over a decade, and set in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the most prestigious culinary institutions in America as a front for something far more dangerous. All she knew was that after 15 years of hiding, of working in small-town diners and pretending to be someone she wasn't, Gladys Smith was about to remember exactly who she used to be. And these students were about to learn why some recipes are classified for reasons that have nothing to do with trade secrets. The examination began with knife skills, a basic brunoise of vegetables that would test precision, speed, and consistency. Wellington's group took their positions with the practiced efficiency of people who'd trained in some of the world's most demanding kitchens. Their movements were coordinated and professional, each cut executed with the kind of precision that came from years of expensive training and access to the finest equipment. James Wellington himself wielded his custom Japanese knife with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a vegetable he couldn't dominate. The blade moved through an onion with surgical precision, creating perfect quarter-inch dice that fell away from the cutting board in neat, uniform piles. Gladys simply picked up her oldest knife, a chef's knife with a wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use, and began to work. Her movements were different from the aggressive efficiency displayed by Wellington's group, where they attacked their ingredients with the confidence of conquerors. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood that cooking was as much about respect as it was about technique. The difference became apparent within minutes. While the other students worked with mechanical precision, Gladys's knife work seemed almost artistic. Her brunoise was not just uniform, it was geometrically perfect, each tiny cube identical to its neighbors with the kind of precision that suggested either incredible skill or impossibly acute spatial awareness. But it was her speed that truly set her apart. Without appearing to rush, without the frantic energy that characterized most professional kitchens, she completed her knife work in half the time it took the others. When Chef Summers came around to inspect the results, she paused at Gladys's station longer than at any other, her experienced eye taking in not just the quality of the cuts, but the effortless way they'd been achieved. "Interesting technique," Chef Summers murmured, making a note on her clipboard. "Where did you train?" Gladys looked up from her cutting board, her brown eyes meeting the instructor's gaze. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. A shadow of memory, perhaps, or the ghost of a different life. "Various places," she said simply. "I've moved around quite a bit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The second phase of the examination called for sauce preparation, a challenge that separated true culinary artists from mere technicians. Chef Summers announced that each student would prepare a classical French mother sauce and 2 derivatives, demonstrating not only technical proficiency, but also an understanding of the fundamental principles that underpinned all Western cuisine. James Wellington cracked his knuckles with theatrical confidence. Sauce work was his specialty, the foundation upon which he'd built his reputation in 3 Michelin-starred establishments. He'd trained under Auguste Beaumont at Le Jardin in Lyon, where sauce preparation was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. His bechamel was legendary among culinary circles, silky, perfectly seasoned, and consistent to the last drop. Amanda Rodriguez chose to demonstrate her expertise with a veloute, the delicate white sauce that required perfect timing and temperature control. Her movements were precise and methodical as she prepared her roux, whisking the flour and butter with the mechanical perfection of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. Tyler Thompson opted for Espagnole, the complex brown sauce. That demanded hours of careful reduction and constant attention. Marcus Miller, ever the traditionalist, began work on a Hollandaise, the temperamental emulsion that could break at the slightest provocation and had ended many promising culinary careers. Around the kitchen, other students were making their selections based on their strengths and training. The air filled with the sounds of professional cooking, the rhythmic chopping of shallots, the gentle simmer of stocks, and the constant whisper of whisks against stainless steel bowls. Gladys surveyed the available ingredients with the same quiet intensity she'd shown during the knife work. Unlike the others, who moved with the aggressive confidence of people trying to prove something, she seemed to be listening to the ingredients themselves, waiting for them to tell her what they wanted to become. She began with what appeared to be a simple Hollandaise, but her technique was unlike anything the other students had seen. Instead of the traditional method taught in culinary schools, the careful whisking over low heat, the gradual incorporation of butter she worked with, a series of subtle adjustments that seemed almost intuitive. Her whisk moved in patterns that created perfect figure eights through the warming egg yolks, and she added the clarified butter in a steady stream that never broke the emulsion. But it was what she did next that made Chef Summers stop dead in her tracks. From her Hollandaise base, Gladys began creating derivatives with a speed and precision that defied comprehension. A béarnaise that required perfect timing to incorporate the tarragon reduction. A sauce maltaise with its delicate orange reduction that could curdle if the temperature varied by even a few degrees. A sauce mousseline so light and airy it seemed to float above the plate. Each sauce was perfect. Not just good, not just professional grade, but flawless in a way that suggested either decades of experience at the highest levels of French cuisine or training that went far beyond what any culinary school could provide. "That's not possible," whispered Tyler Thompson, his own Espagnole forgotten as he watched Gladys work. "You can't make 3 classical derivatives simultaneously. The timing alone, ... But Gladys wasn't finished. From her station, she began preparing what appeared to be a 4th sauce, something that didn't appear on any classical French menu. She worked with ingredients that seemed random, a reduction of red wine and shallots, a carefully controlled emulsion with what looked like specialty oils and seasonings that she measured not with spoons, but with the kind of precision that suggested each grain of salt had been counted. Chef Summers approached Gladys's station with growing fascination. In 30 years of teaching at the Institute, she'd seen exceptional students before. She'd trained future James Beard Award winners and chefs who would go on to earn Michelin stars. But what she was witnessing went beyond exceptional technique. This was artistry at a level that bordered on the impossible. "What are you preparing?" Chef Summers asked quietly, not wanting to break Gladys's concentration. "Something I learned a long time ago," Gladys replied without looking up from her work. "In a place where sauce work meant the difference between life and death." The cryptic response sent a chill through the nearby students. Sauce work that meant the difference between life and death. What kind of kitchen operated under those conditions? James Wellington had stopped his own preparation entirely, his legendary bechamel forgotten as he stared at Gladys's station. His mind was racing, trying to understand what he was witnessing. The level of skill she was demonstrating wasn't something you learned in culinary school, no matter how prestigious. This was the kind of technique that came from years of working at the absolute pinnacle of the profession, in kitchens where failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was career-ending. "Where did you train?" he found himself asking, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching respect. Gladys looked up from her sauces, and for a moment, everyone in the vicinity saw something that made them unconsciously step backward. There was steel in her brown eyes now, and something that suggested she'd worked in places that would make their elite culinary institute look like a children's play kitchen. "Various places," she said simply. "I've learned from some very demanding instructors." But Wellington wasn't satisfied with that answer. His instincts, honed by years of competition in the cutthroat world of high-end dining, told him that there was more to this woman than met the eye. The precision of her movements, the confidence with which she handled techniques that took most chefs years to master, the way she seemed to understand ingredients at a molecular level. These weren't skills you picked up working in chain restaurants or small-town diners. "No one learns technique like that in various places," he pressed, his voice carrying across the kitchen. "That's the kind of sauce work you see in maybe 5 kitchens in the world. Kitchens where they don't just serve food, they create edible art for people who can afford to pay $1,000 for a single meal." Gladys continued working, but something had shifted in her demeanor. The humble, apologetic manner was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more focused. She was adding final touches to her mystery sauce with movements so precise they looked choreographed. "Maybe you're reading too much into basic technique," she said quietly, but there was an edge to her voice now that hadn't been there before. "Basic technique?" Wellington laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lady, what you just did with those derivatives isn't basic anything. That's advanced French classical cuisine at a level that maybe 50 people in the entire world can execute flawlessly." The other students had abandoned their own work entirely now, drawn by the confrontation unfolding at Station 7. Cell phones were appearing, and several people were recording the exchange between the mysterious woman and one of the most famous young chefs in America. Chef Summers was studying Gladys's completed sauces with the intensity of a scientist examining a new discovery. Each one was perfect, not just in taste and consistency, but in presentation. They sat on their plates like edible jewels, each with its own distinct character, yet clearly related through technical mastery that spoke of training at the very highest levels. "These are extraordinary," Chef Summers said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd tasted the work of the world's greatest chefs. "The Béarnaise has perfect acid balance. The Maltaise shows complete understanding of citrus integration, and this 4th sauce." She paused, tasting it again. "I don't recognize this preparation. The flavor profile suggests Mediterranean influences, but the technique is pure French classical. Where did you learn this recipe?" Gladys was already cleaning her station with the methodical precision she applied to everything else. "It's something I developed for a very specific clientele," she said. "People with very particular tastes and very specific dietary requirements." But James Wellington's mind was working now, trying to place her technique within the context of everything he knew about professional cooking. The Mediterranean flavors, the perfect execution, the mysterious nature of her training pieces of a puzzle were starting to form a picture that made his blood run cold. "Dietary requirements," he repeated slowly. "What kind of dietary requirements would require that level of technical precision?" Gladys paused in her cleaning, just for a moment. But it was enough for Wellington to notice. When she looked up at him again, something had changed in her expression. The mask of casual competence had slipped slightly, revealing something that made several students in the vicinity take unconscious steps backward. "The kind where getting it wrong isn't just embarrassing," she said quietly. "It's fatal." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of simmering stocks. Everyone present understood that they'd just heard something significant, even if they couldn't quite grasp what it meant. Chef Summers was still examining Gladys's mystery sauce, her experienced palate trying to identify every component. "This flavor profile," she said slowly. "It's designed to mask something, isn't it? The complexity isn't just for taste, it's functional." Gladys's hand tightened on the dish towel she was using to clean her station. "You have a very perceptive palate, chef. Mask what?" Wellington demanded, his earlier confidence replaced by growing suspicion. What would you need to mask in a sauce that required this level of technical skill? The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Around them, the crowd of students was growing larger, drawn by the confrontation between the mysterious woman and one of the institute's most famous students. Cell phone cameras were recording everything, and Gladys seemed uncomfortable with the attention. But instead of answering Wellington's question directly, she asked one of her own. "Tell me, James," she said, using his first name with a familiarity that suggested she knew more about him than she'd initially let on. "In all your training, in all those Michelin-starred kitchens, did anyone ever teach you that some recipes exist for reasons that have nothing to do with fine dining?" Wellington stared at her, his mind racing. The implication in her words was clear, even if he couldn't quite grasp the full meaning. Recipes that existed for reasons beyond fine dining. Sauces designed to mask flavors. Training where failure meant death rather than just career disappointment. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered. Gladys Smith looked around at the crowd of faces, at the cell phone cameras recording her every move, at the expensive equipment and pristine kitchens that represented the pinnacle of culinary education. Then, she smiled, the expression that was both sad and somehow dangerous. "Nobody important," she said softly. "Just someone who learned to cook in places where the recipes were classified." The third and final phase of the examination would test protein cookery, the ultimate measure of a chef's skill and understanding. Chef Summers announced that each student would be presented with a mystery protein and required to prepare it using any technique they deemed appropriate. But it had to be executed flawlessly and presented with accompanying garnishes that demonstrated both creativity and technical mastery. James Wellington felt his confidence returning as the proteins were distributed. Protein cookery was where he truly excelled, where his training in the world's most demanding kitchens gave him an undeniable advantage. He'd cooked for presidents and prime ministers, had prepared dishes for galas where a single mistake could end careers. When he saw his assignment, a pristine piece of Australian Wagyu beef, he allowed himself a small smile. This was his territory. Amanda Rodriguez received duck breast, a protein that required precise temperature control and perfect timing to avoid the dual disasters of overcooking the meat or undercooking the fat. Tyler Thompson was handed fresh halibut, its pristine white flesh demanding delicate treatment that would showcase its natural flavors without overwhelming them. Marcus Miller drew lamb rack, a cut that would test his ability to balance the meat's natural richness with complementary flavors and textures. When Chef Summers approached Gladys's station, she carried a covered tray that seemed somehow different from the others. The chef instructor's expression was unreadable as she set it down, but there was something in her eyes that suggested this wasn't a random assignment. "Your protein," Chef Summers said quietly, lifting the cover to reveal what lay beneath. Other students who could see craned their necks for a better look, and several audible gasps echoed through the kitchen. Lying on the tray was what appeared to be a whole fish, but not one that any of them recognized. Its scales had an almost iridescent quality, and its size suggested it was some sort of exotic species that wouldn't be found in any normal culinary supply catalog. "What the hell is that?" Tyler Thompson whispered loud enough for others to hear. Chef Summers's voice carried a note of challenge when she spoke. "Mediterranean bluefin. Wild caught, never frozen. Extremely rare, extremely expensive, and extremely difficult to prepare properly. The flesh is delicate enough that conventional cooking methods will destroy its texture entirely." Gladys studied the fish with the same quiet intensity she'd shown throughout the examination, but something had changed in her demeanor. Where before she'd seemed almost apologetic about her presence in the elite kitchen, now she appeared completely focused, as if the sight of this particular protein had awakened something that had been dormant for years. "Interesting choice," she said simply. running her fingers along the fish's scales with a familiarity that suggested she'd handled similar specimens before. "I haven't worked with one of these in quite some time." Wellington was watching her carefully, now his own Wagyu forgotten for the moment. There was something about the way she touched the fish, the confidence in her movements, that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with exotic proteins. Most chefs, even experienced ones, would have shown at least some hesitation when faced with an unfamiliar species. Gladys looked like she was greeting an old friend. "You've cooked this before?" Chef Summers asked, making no attempt to hide her curiosity. "Once or twice," Gladys replied, but there was something evasive in her tone that suggested the number was considerably higher than that. "In specialized circumstances." She began her preparation with movements that were economical and precise, but completely unlike the techniques being employed by the other students. While they were following classical methods taught in culinary schools around the world, Gladys was doing something entirely different. Her knife work on the fish was surgical in its precision, but the cuts she was making didn't follow any recognizable pattern. Wellington abandoned his own preparation entirely, moving closer to observe what she was doing. His trained eye could recognize exceptional technique when he saw it, but what Gladys was demonstrating went beyond exceptional. It was as if she understood the fish at a molecular level, knew exactly how its flesh would respond to heat and seasoning in ways that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "That's not a standard filleting technique," he said, unable to keep the fascination out of his voice. "No," Gladys agreed without looking up from her work. "Standard techniques don't work with this species. The muscle fiber structure is too complex, and the fat distribution requires a different approach entirely." "Where did you learn that approach?" Wellington pressed dot for the first time since the examination began. Gladys paused in her work. She looked up at him with those brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond what her modest appearance suggested. "From someone who understood that cooking isn't always about making food taste good," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's about making sure it doesn't kill you." The cryptic response sent another chill through the gathered students. Tyler Thompson had stopped pretending to work on his halibut entirely, and Amanda Rodriguez was openly staring at Gladys's station. Even Marcus Miller, normally focused too, the point of obsession, had paused in his lamb preparation to listen. Chef Summers moved closer, her professional curiosity overriding her role as an impartial examiner. "What do you mean by that?" Gladys resumed her work, but her movements had taken on an urgency that hadn't been there before. "This particular species," she said, gesturing toward the fish, "accumulates certain toxins in specific parts of its anatomy. If you don't know exactly where to cut, exactly which parts to avoid, a single mistake can be problematic." "Problematic? How?" Wellington demanded. "The kind of problematic that requires immediate medical attention," Gladys replied matter-of-factly, "assuming medical attention arrives in time." The kitchen had gone completely silent now. Even the students working at distant stations had stopped their preparations to listen to the conversation unfolding around Station 7. The implications of what Gladys was saying were staggering. She wasn't just demonstrating advanced culinary technique, she was claiming knowledge of toxicology that went far beyond anything taught in culinary school. "You're saying this fish is poisonous?" Amanda Rodriguez asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not poisonous," Gladys corrected. "Toxic. There's a difference. Poison is added to something. Toxicity is inherent. And yes, if prepared incorrectly, this fish can cause paralysis, respiratory failure, and death within 30 minutes of consumption." Chef Summers was staring at the fish with new understanding. "That's why you assigned this to her," she said suddenly, her voice directed not at Gladys but at someone else entirely. "You knew she'd recognize it." All eyes turned to follow Chef Summers's gaze, and for the first time, the students noticed A figure standing in the observation gallery above the main kitchen. He was a tall man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit rather than chef's whites, and he'd been watching the examination with the kind of intensity that suggested he was more than just a casual observer. Director Morrison, Chef Summers, called up to the gallery. Perhaps you'd like to explain why you specifically requested that we use Mediterranean bluefin for today's examination? Director Morrison, a name that several students recognized as belonging to the Institute's board of directors, made his way down to the kitchen floor with deliberate steps. When he reached Gladys's station, he studied her work with the kind of attention that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at. Because, he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, I wanted to see if our mystery student was really who I suspected she might be. Gladys had gone completely still, her knife frozen above the fish she'd been preparing. When she looked up at Director Morrison, the modest, apologetic demeanor was completely gone, replaced by something that made every person in the vicinity take an unconscious step backward. Director Morrison, she said, and her voice carried a warning that was unmistakable. I think you're mistaken about who I am. Am I? Morrison smiled, but it was the kind of expression that suggested he held all the cards in whatever game they were playing. Because the woman I'm thinking of was trained by the CIS Culinary Intelligence Division. A unit that doesn't officially exist, of course, but one that specializes in preparing foods that can be enhanced with various additives without detection. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Wellington felt his mouth go dry as the implications hit him. CIA Culinary Intelligence. Food that could be enhanced with additives. He was beginning to understand that the examination he'd thought was about demonstrating cooking skills had become something else entirely. That woman you're thinking of, Gladys said quietly, her hands perfectly steady despite the bomb that had just been dropped, retired a long time ago. She doesn't exist anymore. Retired? Morrison laughed. People with your training don't retire, Miss Smith. They just go underground for a while. But skills like yours, the ability to prepare exotic proteins, to create sauces that can mask the taste of virtually any additive, to understand toxicology at a level that most doctors would envy, those skills don't just disappear. Around them, the crowd of students was pressing closer, cell phones recording every word of the confrontation. This was no longer a culinary examination. It was the exposure of something that was supposed to have remained buried forever. What are you saying? Wellington found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Morrison turned to address the gathered students, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture. I'm saying that your mystery classmate isn't just an exceptionally skilled chef. She's someone who is trained to use food as a weapon. Someone who knows how to prepare meals that can incapacitate, interrogate, or eliminate targets without anyone ever suspecting that the cause was culinary rather than medical. Gladys's grip on her knife had tightened, and for a moment, everyone in the vicinity felt the presence of something genuinely dangerous. This wasn't just a middle-aged woman who happened to be good with a blade. This was someone who had been trained to kill with kitchen implements and make it look accidental. Director Morrison, she said, her voice carrying a finality that made several students unconsciously step toward the exits. You have no idea what you're doing. On the contrary, Morrison replied, his confidence growing now that he'd revealed his hand. I know exactly what I'm doing. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The confrontation between Gladys and Director Morrison had transformed the pristine teaching kitchen into something that felt more like an interrogation room. The other students stood frozen at their stations, their culinary examinations forgotten, as they witnessed what was clearly a moment that would change everything they thought they knew about cooking, espionage, and the woman who had just demonstrated impossible skills. Morrison circled Gladys's station like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. His expensive suit and polished demeanor couldn't quite hide the calculating intelligence that had brought him to this moment. He'd been planning this confrontation for weeks, maybe months, waiting for the right opportunity to expose secrets that were supposed to have died 15 years ago. "Let me tell you what I think happened," Morrison said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd done his homework thoroughly. 15 years ago, a woman named Catherine Miller, that was your real name, wasn't it, was recruited by a division of the CIA that most people in government don't even know exists. The Culinary Intelligence Unit. Gladys continued working on her fish preparation, but her movements had become mechanical, automatic. She was listening to every word while her hands performed tasks that had been drilled into her muscle memory through years of training in facilities that didn't appear on any official maps. The CIU, Morrison continued, was established in the 1990s when intelligence agencies realized that food was the perfect delivery system for, let's call them, enhanced substances. Diplomats have to eat. Foreign officials attend state dinners. Targets visit restaurants. And everyone trusts a good meal prepared by a talented chef. James Wellington felt his world tilting on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about professional cooking, about the culinary world he devoted his life to, was being rewritten in real time. "You're talking about poisoning people," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Poisoning is such an ugly word," Morrison replied smoothly. The CIU preferred terms like nutritional intelligence gathering and gastropharmaceutical intervention. Much more civilized, don't you think? Chef Summers had backed away from the confrontation, her face pale with the realization that her prestigious institute had somehow become ground zero for the exposure of classified government operations. Around the kitchen, students were recording everything on their phones, documenting what would undoubtedly become one of the most explosive intelligence scandals in decades. "The beauty of the program," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of an academic lecture, "was its sophistication. Traditional poisoning is crude, obvious, easily detected by modern forensics. But what if you could create substances that mimicked natural causes? Heart attacks, strokes, allergic reactions, all perfectly explainable, all completely untraceable." Gladys finally looked up from her work, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived with terrible knowledge for far too long. "You're describing murder, Director Morrison. Mass murder carried out under the guise of fine dining. I'm describing necessary operations carried out by patriots who understood that sometimes democracy requires difficult choices," Morrison shot back. "Operations that saved American lives by eliminating threats before they could materialize into something worse." Tyler Thompson had been listening with growing horror, his culinary dreams crumbling as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. "How many people?" he whispered. "How many people were killed?" Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "That information remains classified. But I can tell you that Catherine Miller, our Gladys here, was one of the most effective operatives the program ever produced. 17 confirmed eliminations. Over a 6-year period, each one designed to look like natural causes or accidental food poisoning. The kitchen had gone dead silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of normal institute operations continuing in other parts of the building." The students stared at Gladys with a mixture of horror and fascination, trying to reconcile the modest woman they'd met that morning with the government assassin being described by Morrison. "That woman doesn't exist anymore," Gladys said firmly. But there was something in her voice that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as everyone else. "Catherine Miller died in a car accident outside Prague in 2009. The official report will confirm that." "Yes, the official report," Morrison laughed. "Quite convincing, actually. Complete with dental records, DNA evidence, and tearful testimony from supposed colleagues. The CIA does excellent work when it comes to eliminating inconvenient personnel. Files. Amanda Rodriguez found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why? Why would you fake your own death? For the first time since the confrontation began, Gladys's professional composure cracked. Her hands stilled on the fish she'd been preparing, and when she looked up, there was pain in her eyes that spoke of losses that couldn't be measured in dollars or careers. Because I discovered that the CIU wasn't just eliminating foreign threats, she said quietly. We were killing American citizens. Journalists who were getting too close to classified stories. Whistleblowers who wanted to expose government corruption. Politicians who were asking too many questions about black budget operations. The weight of her words settled over the kitchen like a physical presence. Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly as Gladys continued speaking, her voice gaining strength as she finally shared secrets she'd carried for 15 years. The Prague operation was supposed to be my last, she said. A European Union finance minister who was going to expose money laundering operations connected to several American defense contractors. But when I got there, when I saw the target, she paused, her hands trembling slightly as memory overwhelmed her carefully constructed defenses. It was David Harrison, investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, American citizen, father of 2 daughters. He'd been investigating connections between the Pentagon and private military contractors, following a money trail that led back to some very powerful people in Washington. Morrison's face had gone pale. Harrison was a threat to national security. His investigation would have compromised ongoing operations and put American lives at risk. Harrison was a patriot, Gladys shot back, her voice carrying a fury that made several students step backward. He was trying to expose the same corruption that I'd been unknowingly helping to protect. When I realized what I'd been asked to do, what I'd been doing for 6 years. She gestured toward the fish on her cutting board, its preparation now taking on sinister new meaning. I refused the mission. Told my handler I was done, that I wouldn't be part of killing American citizens to protect government corruption. That's when I learned that the CIU doesn't accept resignations. Wellington was staring at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. They tried to kill you. The car accident in Prague wasn't an accident, Gladys confirmed. It was supposed to eliminate a liability who knew too much about operations that could never be acknowledged. But I survived barely. Spent 3 months in a Czech hospital with injuries that should have killed me. And then you disappeared, Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of grudging admiration. New identity, new life, completely off the grid. Very impressive for someone with massive internal injuries and no official support structure. Gladys smiled, but it was an expression completely devoid of warmth. I had help. Turns out David Harrison wasn't the only person investigating government corruption. There are good people, who believe that democracy requires transparency, even when that transparency is inconvenient for powerful interests. The implications were staggering. Not only had Gladys survived an assassination attempt by her own government, but she'd been helped by what sounded like an organized resistance movement within the intelligence community itself. Who helped you? Morrison demanded, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching desperation. Names. I need names. You need a lot of things, Director Morrison, Gladys replied calmly. But the one thing you're not going to get from me is information that would put good people at risk. Around them, the crowd of students was pressing closer, their phones recording every word of what was clearly the most explosive intelligence scandal to emerge in decades. Morrison seemed to suddenly realize that their conversation was being documented by dozens of witnesses, and his face went ashen. You can't prove any of this, he said desperately. It's the word of a mentally unstable woman with a history of violent behavior against a respected education director with 30 years of government service. Gladys reached into her chef's coat and withdrew a small digital recording device. The Kind that could store hours of audio in a package no larger than a thumb drive. Actually, she said with quiet satisfaction, I can prove all of it, including your role in continuing CIU operations through the Monterey Culinary Institute. Morrison's face went white. That's impossible. The CIU was disbanded after the Prague incident. Disbanded officially, Gladys agreed. But you and I both know that operations like this don't just disappear. They evolve. They find new cover stories, new funding sources, new ways to accomplish the same objectives. She gestured around the pristine kitchen with its state-of-the-art equipment and elite student body. What better cover for a culinary intelligence operation than a prestigious cooking school? Who would suspect that some of the most talented young chefs in America were being recruited for something other than restaurant careers? The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the kitchen was beginning to understand that they hadn't just enrolled in a culinary institute. They'd walked into the middle of an ongoing intelligence operation that used food as a weapon and chefs as assassins. And Gladys Smith, the unremarkable middle-aged woman they'd all underestimated, was about to bring the entire operation crashing down. The digital recorder in Gladys's hand seemed to pulse with dangerous energy as she held it up for everyone to see. Director Morrison stared at the device as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his heart, which, in many ways, it was. This contains recordings of conversations spanning the last 3 years, Gladys said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd planned this moment for longer than anyone could imagine. Conversations between institute faculty, members discussing special placement opportunities for graduating students, discussions about government contracts that don't appear in any public records, and most importantly, detailed planning sessions for what you call culinary diplomacy missions. James Wellington felt his legs go weak. The implications were staggering. Everything he'd worked for, every achievement in his culinary career, was suddenly cast in a sinister new light. Are you saying that some of us ... that we've been recruited without knowing it? Not recruited, Gladys corrected, evaluated. The Institute has been functioning as a screening facility, identifying students with the right combination of skills, psychological profiles, and moral flexibility to be developed into operatives. Chef Summers backed away from the group, her face pale with dawning horror. The psychological evaluations we conduct on all students, she whispered. The detailed background checks, the personality assessments. We were told it was for placement assistance. Asterisk, it was for placement assistance, Morrison said desperately, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the kitchen's controlled temperature. Just not the kind of placement you thought. Amanda Rodriguez was scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers. My background check took 3 months, she said, her voice barely audible. They asked about my family, my political views, whether I'd be willing to work overseas for extended periods. I thought it was normal for an elite program. Nothing about this program has been normal, Gladys replied. The Monterey Culinary Institute has been operating as a front for intelligence recruitment since 2011. Students who demonstrate exceptional technical skills and show certain psychological markers are tracked for potential development into what the current program calls gastrointelligence specialists. Tyler Thompson was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The advanced classes we take in food chemistry, he said slowly. The ones about molecular interactions, about how different compounds affect human physiology. Those weren't just about modernist cuisine, were they? No, Gladys confirmed. They were about understanding how to enhance food with substances that could serve intelligence purposes. Sedatives that taste like natural umami. Stimulants that mimic the effects of caffeine. Memory inhibitors that can be masked by complex flavor profiles. Morrison made a sudden move toward the kitchen's emergency exit, but Gladys's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Director. You see, this conversation isn't just being recorded by student phones. I've been broadcasting everything to several very interested parties through a satellite uplink that's been hidden in my knife case for the past 6 months. The director froze, his face cycling through expressions of rage, fear, and calculation. What parties? Gladys smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was genuine warmth in the expression. Remember when I mentioned that good people helped me disappear after Prague? Well, some of those people have spent the last 15 years documenting exactly how deep the corruption goes. They've been waiting for an opportunity to expose the entire network. She pulled out a specialized communication device that looked like a standard smartphone, but clearly contained technology far more advanced than anything available to civilians. "Agent Harrison, this is Ghost," she said into the device. "The package is delivered. Authorization Tango 77. The response came through clearly enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. "Copy that, Ghost. FBI teams are moving to secure all Institute facilities. DHS has taken custody of Director Morrison and all associated personnel. Justice Department prosecutors are standing by for full debrief." The sound of vehicles screeching to a halt outside the building echoed through the kitchen's windows. Within moments, the distant sound of heavy footsteps and authoritative voices could be heard moving through the Institute's corridors. "Agent Harrison?" Wellington repeated, his mind struggling to process the rapidly unfolding events. "David Harrison? The journalist you were supposed to kill in Prague?" "David Harrison survived Prague too," Gladys explained. "Turned out the CIA wasn't the only organization with people inside this CIU operation. The FBI had been investigating the program for years, trying to build a case against the network of officials who'd been using government resources for private assassination contracts." Morrison's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation became clear. "You've been working with federal law enforcement this entire time." "For 15 years, Gladys confirmed. "Ever since Harrison's people found me in that Prague hospital and offered me a choice: disappear forever and let the corruption continue, or help them build an airtight case that would bring down everyone involved." The kitchen doors burst open as FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the space, their weapons drawn and their movements coordinated with military precision. Students scattered to the walls, phones still recording everything as federal agents took control of the scene. "Director Morrison," the lead agent announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, treason, and violation of federal statutes regarding the use of government resources for unauthorized operations." As Miranda rights were read in handcuffs applied, Morrison looked back at Gladys with something approaching admiration. "You played this perfectly," he said. The vulnerable student routine, the gradual revelation of skills, building to this moment when everything would be documented by dozens of witnesses. "Very impressive tradecraft. I had good teachers," Gladys replied. "Some of them were even on the right side." Chef Summers was being led away by another team of agents, her career and reputation destroyed by revelations she claimed to have known nothing about. "The Institute," she said desperately. "What happens to the legitimate students? The ones who just wanted to learn cooking?" FBI agent Harrison, apparently David Harrison himself, the journalist whose attempted assassination had started this entire chain of events, stepped forward to address the gathered students. "The Monterey Culinary Institute will be closed pending a complete investigation," he announced. "However, the Department of Justice is working with several legitimate culinary schools to ensure that students who were enrolled in good faith will be able to complete their educations without penalty." Amanda Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. "What about those of us who might have been selected for the other program?" "The intelligence program." Harrison's expression softened. "If you were approached for any special opportunities or asked to participate in activities beyond normal culinary training, we'll need to speak with you extensively. You may have witnessed or participated in activities that constitute federal crimes, even if you weren't aware of their true nature. The magnitude of the conspiracy was becoming clear as more agents moved through the institute, securing evidence and interviewing staff and students. This wasn't just about a few rogue operatives. It was about a systematic corruption of one of America's most prestigious culinary institutions, turning it into a recruitment and training center for government. Assassins. Tyler Thompson approached Gladys as the chaos swirled around them. "Miss Smith, or should I call you Ms. Miller? Can I ask you something?" "Gladys is fine," she replied. Catherine Miller really did die in Prague. I've been Gladys Smith for so long now that it feels more real than my original identity. Why did you come here? Why risk exposing yourself when you could have stayed hidden forever? Gladys looked around at the kitchen where she just brought down a conspiracy that had been operating for over a decade. Because 15 years ago, I made a promise to David Harrison and to myself. I promised that someday, when the time was right, I would make sure the truth came out. I would make sure that no more good people died to protect the corruption of bad people. She gestured toward the recording equipment that was now being carefully cataloged by FBI technicians. This contains evidence of at least 47 assassination missions carried out under the guise of culinary diplomacy. 47 people who died because they were investigating corruption, asking inconvenient questions, or simply standing in the way of powerful interests. Wellington was staring at his hands again, probably wondering how many of the techniques he'd learned in prestigious kitchens around the world had actually been developed for purposes far removed from fine dining. "What happens now?" Agent Harrison answered before Gladys could respond. "Now we prosecute everyone involved in this conspiracy. From the directors who created the program, to the handlers who managed the operations, to the operatives who carried out the missions. This is going to be one of the largest intelligence scandals in American history. Asterisk. And the students?" Amanda asked. "Those of us who were being evaluated for recruitment." "You were victims," Harrison said firmly. "Victims of a system that perverted your love of cooking and turned it into something dangerous. The Justice Department will ensure that your careers aren't destroyed by the crimes of others." As the FBI continued processing the scene, Gladys found herself standing alone at her cooking station, looking down at the Mediterranean bluefin she'd been preparing when this all began. The fish that had been intended to test her knowledge of exotic toxins now seemed almost quaint compared to the scope of the conspiracy that had just been exposed. "James." Wellington approached her one final time. "Miss Smith, Gladys, I have to ask. Your skills, your knowledge, are you going back to that life?" Gladys smiled and began cleaning her knives with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the day. "No," she said simply. "I'm going back to my real life. The quiet one, where I cook food that's meant to nourish people rather than harm them." She looked around at the chaos of the federal investigation, at the students whose lives had just been turned upside down, at the evidence of a conspiracy that had corrupted one of America's most respected institutions. "But first," she added, "I'm going to help make sure that everyone responsible for this pays the price for what they've done." 3 hours after the FBI raid began, the Monterey Culinary Institute had been transformed into a federal crime scene. Evidence teams moved through every room with methodical precision, photographing documents, confiscating computer equipment, and interviewing staff members who claimed to know nothing about the Institute's true purpose. But as the investigation deepened, Agent David Harrison was beginning to realize that what they'd uncovered was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. In a secure conference room that had been hastily established in the Institute's administrative wing, Harrison sat across from Gladys as she systematically walked federal investigators through 15 years of carefully gathered intelligence. The walls were now covered with photographs, organizational charts, and timelines that painted a picture of corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. The Monterey Institute was just one node in a much larger network, Gladys explained, pointing to a map that showed similar facilities across the country. There are at least 12 other culinary schools, restaurants, and catering companies that have been infiltrated or established specifically to support the program. Harrison studied the map with growing concern. Red pins marked locations from Seattle to Miami, each representing what appeared to be a legitimate food service operation that was actually serving as cover for intelligence activities. How long has this network been operational? The current incarnation began in 2005, Gladys replied. But the concept goes back much further. During the Cold War, the CIA experimented with using restaurant staff and catering services for intelligence gathering. What made the modern program different was its focus on targeted elimination rather than information collection. Special Agent Sarah Chun, the FBI's lead investigator on intelligence-related crimes, leaned forward with interest. You're saying this evolved from surveillance to assassination? Not evolved, Gladys corrected. Expanded. The surveillance operations never stopped. They just added elimination capabilities when traditional intelligence gathering wasn't sufficient to protect certain interests. She pulled out a thick folder filled with documents that had been hidden in her modest apartment for over a decade. These are copies of communications between program administrators and their clients. Yes, clients. The CIU wasn't just carrying out government-sanctioned operations. They were providing services to private contractors, multinational corporations, and foreign governments willing to pay for discrete problem-solving. Harrison felt his blood run cold as he scanned the documents. Purchase orders for culinary consultation services that coincided with the mysterious deaths of investigative journalists. Invoices for menu development that aligned with the timing of corporate whistleblower scandals. Payment authorizations that suggested the program had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over the past decade. This wasn't just about national security, he said quietly. This was about profit. National security was the cover story, Gladys agreed. The reality was that certain people within the intelligence community discovered they could monetize their training and resources by offering elimination services to anyone willing to pay the price. Agent Chun was photographing every document with a specialized camera that would preserve them as evidence. Who was running the financial side of the operation? Gladys smiled grimly and pulled out another folder. That's where things get really interesting. The money flowed through a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts. But if you track it carefully, it all leads back to 3 individuals who've been positioning themselves as patriotic defenders of American interests. She spread out a series of financial documents that showed money flows between various government contractors, private military companies, and what appeared to be legitimate educational institutions. Senator Robert Crawford, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, Deputy Secretary of Defense Michael Torres, who oversees black budget operations, and perhaps most surprisingly, Federal Judge Patricia Williams, who's been ensuring that any investigations into these activities get buried in legal technicalities. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Not only had a rogue intelligence program been eliminated American citizens for profit, but it had been protected by corruption reaching into all 3 branches of government. Judge Williams, Harrison repeated, his mind racing through the implications. She's presided over at least 6 cases involving mysterious deaths that were connected to corporate or government whistleblowing. In every case, the investigations were shut down due to lack of evidence or national security concerns. Not coincidentally, Gladys confirmed. The program couldn't have operated for this long without judicial protection. Every time someone got too close to the truth, Williams made sure the legal system worked in their favor. Agent Chun was already on her secure phone, coordinating with other FBI field offices to begin simultaneous arrests of the key conspirators. The investigation that had begun with a culinary school examination was rapidly expanding into what would become one of the largest corruption cases in American history. "There's something else," Gladys said, her voice taking on a note of urgency that made both agents focus their complete attention on her. "The program didn't just target random individuals. They've been systematically eliminating people who were investigating a specific pattern of financial crimes." She pulled out a final folder, this one containing documents that looked like they'd been compiled over many years by someone with access to classified information from multiple government agencies. "For the past 15 years, someone has been stealing advanced military technology and selling it to foreign governments," she continued. "The profits from these sales have been used to fund private military operations that serve the interests of a shadow network of defense contractors, intelligence officials, and politicians." Harrison studied the documents with growing amazement. "This is evidence of treason on a massive scale. The people I was ordered to eliminate," Gladys said quietly, "weren't random threats to national security. They were investigators, journalists, and government officials who had discovered pieces of this technology trafficking operation. The KIU program was created specifically to protect the trafficking network by eliminating anyone who got too close to exposing it." The conference room fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about a rogue assassination program. It was about a systematic effort to undermine American national security for private profit, protected by corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Agent Chun finished her phone call and turned back to Gladys with an expression of grim determination. "We're going to need you to testify before a grand jury about everything you've just told us. Are you prepared for that level of exposure?" Gladys nodded without hesitation. "I've been preparing for this moment for 15 years. Catherine Miller died so that Gladys Smith could live long enough to bring this network down. I'm ready to finish what we started." Harrison was studying the organizational chart that now covered most of one wall, tracing connections between dozens of individuals and organizations that had seemed unrelated until now. "The technology trafficking, do you have evidence of specific transactions?" "Better than that," Gladys replied, pulling out a small storage device that looked like an ordinary USB drive. "I have complete records of every sale, including serial numbers of stolen equipment, names of buyers, and bank records showing where the profits went." She handed the drive to Agent Chun with the careful precision of someone transferring something invaluable. "This drive contains financial records, communication intercepts, and photographic evidence gathered over 15 years by people who risked their lives to document these crimes." As Chun plugged the drive into a secure laptop, Harrison found himself looking at Gladys with new understanding. "You weren't just gathering evidence about the assassination program. You were building a comprehensive case against the entire corruption network." "David Harrison wasn't the only journalist investigating this story," Gladys confirmed. "There was a whole network of people, reporters, federal agents, military officials, congressional staffers who had pieces of the puzzle. The assassination program was designed to eliminate them before they could put those pieces together." The laptop screen filled with folders containing thousands of documents, photographs, and audio recordings. It was clear that this wasn't the work of a single person operating alone. It was the result of a coordinated investigation that had been operating in secret for over a decade. "How many people were involved in gathering this evidence?" Chun asked. 47, Gladys replied, and the number sent a chill through both agents. The same number of people who were eliminated by the KIU program. Every assassination was carried out to prevent the exposure of this evidence. Harrison felt the weight of 47 lives settling on his shoulders. Journalists, investigators, and government officials who had died because they'd tried to expose crimes against their own country. And now we have everything they died trying to reveal. Not everything, Gladys corrected. This is just the foundation. The people running this network are still operational, still selling American secrets to foreign governments, still using their positions of power to protect their criminal enterprise. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the FBI vehicles that still surrounded the Institute. But for the first time in 15 years, we have them in a position where they can't simply eliminate the threat. This is too public, too well documented, too widely witnessed. Agent Chun was scrolling through the evidence files with amazement. This is enough to bring down dozens of high-level officials across multiple agencies and branches of government. That's the idea, Gladys said simply. Democracy can't survive when the people sworn to protect it are using their power to subvert it for personal gain. As if summoned by her words, Harrison's secure phone rang with an incoming call from FBI headquarters in Washington. He answered with growing tension, listening to a conversation that would determine whether the investigation they'd just launched would be allowed to proceed or would be buried under the same kind of political pressure that had protected the network for so many years. When he hung up, his expression was grim but determined. That was the director. We have 48 hours to make arrests before certain parties try to classify this entire investigation as a matter of national security. Gladys smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was genuine satisfaction in her expression. Then we'd better get started. I have a list of exactly who needs to be arrested, where they can be found, and what evidence will be needed to convict them. The race against time had begun, and the ghost who had spent 15 years gathering evidence was finally ready to ensure that justice would be served. The FBI Strategic Operations Center in Washington, D.C. had been transformed into a war room within 6 hours of the Monterey raid. Multiple screens displayed real-time surveillance, footage from locations across the country where suspected network members were under observation. Agent Harrison coordinated the operation from the center while Agent Chun remained in California, continuing to extract intelligence from Gladys and the evidence cache she'd provided. The scope of the simultaneous arrest operation was unprecedented. Federal agents in 12 states were positioning themselves outside the homes and offices of senators, judges, military officials, and corporate executives who had been identified as part of the conspiracy. Each arrest had to be perfectly timed to prevent the network from activating whatever contingency plans they undoubtedly had in place. Status report from all field teams, Harrison announced into his headset, watching as confirmations appeared on the central display screen. Seattle team in position outside Senator Crawford's residence, came the first response. Subject is currently inside, no security detail visible. Miami team ready at Deputy Secretary Torres's hotel, reported another voice. He's attending a defense contractor conference. Building security has been briefed and is cooperating. D.C. team has Judge Williams under surveillance at the federal courthouse, added a third. She's in session, but we can take her during the next recess. One by one, the reports came in from teams positioned across the country. The network that had operated in secret for 15 years was about to be dismantled in a single coordinated strike. But in Monterey, Gladys was growing increasingly concerned about something she hadn't yet shared with the federal agents. There's a problem, she told Agent Chen as they reviewed the final arrest warrants. The people you're targeting, Crawford, Torres, Williams, they're not the top of the hierarchy. They're middle management. Chun looked up from her laptop with alarm. What do you mean? The real architects of this operation are people whose names don't appear in any of the documents we've provided, Gladys explained. They've been careful to insulate themselves from direct involvement, using the senators and judges as a buffer layer. She pulled out a hand-drawn organizational chart that looked like it had been created over many years, with connections and relationships marked in different colors of ink. The actual leadership consists of 3 individuals who've been manipulating American foreign policy for decades. She continued. Charles Morrison, director, Morrison's older brother, and a former CIA director who officially retired in 2010, but has been running private intelligence operations ever since. Margaret Hayes, a defense contractor who controls over $60 billion in military contracts and has been selling classified technology to the highest bidders. And Thomas Crawford, Senator Crawford's father, who built a fortune in military logistics by ensuring that American conflicts never end quickly enough to threaten his profit margins. Agent Chun felt her blood run cold. These people have been engineering conflicts to maintain their business model? Not just engineering them, Gladys confirmed, creating them. The technology sales to foreign governments weren't random, they were specifically designed to create military imbalances that would require American intervention. Wars that could be prolonged indefinitely as long as both sides had access to advanced weapons. The implications were staggering. The conspiracy wasn't just about protecting criminal profits. It was about manipulating global conflicts to generate those profits in the first place. Where are these three now? Chun asked, already reaching for her secure phone. That's the problem, Gladys replied grimly. They disappeared 18 hours ago. Our surveillance network detected unusual movement patterns among their security details, and all three have gone dark. No cell phone communications, no credit card transactions, no digital footprints of any kind. Chun was already dialing Harrison's direct line. David, we have a major problem. The real leadership has gone underground. Harrison's voice crackled through the secure connection, tension evident even through the encrypted channel. How is that possible? We've had electronic surveillance on all suspected network members for the past week. Because they've been planning for this contingency for years, Gladys interjected, taking the phone from Chun. The moment Director Morrison was arrested, automated systems would have triggered protocols to protect the senior leadership. They're probably already out of the country. The war room in Washington fell silent as the implications became clear. The massive arrest operation they'd spent hours planning would capture the operational layer of the conspiracy. But the architects would escape to continue their activities from overseas locations. Do we abort? One of the field commanders asked over the radio. Harrison looked at the screen showing dozens of FBI teams in position across the country. Aborting now would mean losing their only chance to arrest the middle-tier conspirators. But proceeding would alert the senior leadership that their entire operation had been compromised. No, he said finally, we proceed with the arrests. Even if we can't get the top layer today, we can't let the people we can reach escape justice. But Gladys had a different idea. There might be another way, she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd spent 15 years planning for this exact scenario. The senior leadership may have disappeared, but they haven't abandoned their operation entirely. They'll try to salvage what they can, which means they'll need to access resources they've hidden in various locations. She pulled out a map of the United States marked with dozens of red dots. These are safe houses, weapons caches, and financial repositories that the network has established over the years. If we can monitor all of them simultaneously, we can track the senior leadership when they try to access their contingency resources. Agent Chun studied the map with growing amazement. How do you know about all these locations? Because I helped establish some of them, Gladys admitted. During my years with the CIU, part of my job was creating infrastructure that could support long-term operations. Every safe house I set up, I documented. Every weapons cache I established, I recorded. The exact contents and location. Harrison's voice came through the phone with new energy. How many locations are we talking about? 43 facilities across 28 states, Gladys replied. If we can position surveillance teams at each location and monitor them for the next 72 hours, we'll catch them when they try to access their escape resources. The logistics of monitoring 43 locations simultaneously would strain the FBI's resources to their limits, but it was their only chance of catching the senior leadership before they could establish new operations overseas. "Do it," Harrison ordered. "All field teams maintain current positions for the primary arrests, but I want secondary teams moving to monitor every location on Gladys's list." As federal agents across the country began the most complex surveillance operation in FBI history, a new concern was emerging from the evidence still being analyzed in Monterey. "There's something else," Gladys told Chun as she reviewed financial records on her laptop. The technology sales weren't just about generating profits from conflicts. Some of the equipment that was sold has been modified with backdoor access codes. Chun looked up sharply. "Backdoor access to what?" "Everything," Gladys replied, her voice heavy with the implications. "Communication systems, weapons guidance computers, aircraft navigation equipment, satellite networks. The senior leadership hasn't just been selling American technology to foreign governments, they've been selling them compromised technology that can be remotely controlled." The scope of the national security breach was beyond anything anyone had imagined. Not only had classified military technology been sold to foreign powers, but that technology had been deliberately compromised to allow continued American control over foreign military systems. They've been playing both sides, Chun realized. Selling weapons to create conflicts, then maintaining the ability to control those weapons remotely. Which means, Gladys continued, that right now, somewhere in the world, there are military systems belonging to foreign governments that can be accessed and controlled by 3 American criminals who are trying to escape justice. Agent Chun was already coordinating with the Pentagon Cybersecurity Division to identify and disable the compromised systems, but the damage that could be done before they could regain control was potentially catastrophic. "How long have these backdoor systems been operational?" she asked. Gladys consulted her records with the methodical precision that had characterized all her work. The earliest compromised sales date, back to 2008, we're potentially looking at thousands of military systems across dozens of countries that could be remotely controlled by the network leadership. As if summoned by their conversation, Harrison's voice crackled through the radio with urgent news. All teams were getting reports of unusual activity at 3 separate locations. Charles Morrison was spotted accessing a safe house outside Denver. Margaret Hayes triggered surveillance systems at a weapons cache in Nevada. And Thomas Crawford just used a credit card at a private airfield in Wyoming. The hunt was on. After 15 years of planning and preparation, the final confrontation between Gladys Smith and the network that had tried to erase her was about to begin. "Agent Chun," Gladys said quietly, checking the contents of her knife case one final time. "I think it's time for Catherine Miller to make one last appearance." The woman who had spent 15 years living as a modest culinary student was preparing to become, one final time, the government operative who had once been capable of eliminating targets that threatened national security. But this time, she would be hunting the people who had corrupted that system for their own profit. 6 months after the arrests that became known as Operation Ghost Kitchen, Catherine Miller, she had legally reclaimed her original name, stood before the Senate Intelligence Committee in a hearing room packed with journalists, family members of victims, and federal prosecutors who had spent months building the most comprehensive corruption case in American history. The trials had been swift and decisive. Senator Robert Crawford, Deputy Secretary Michael Torres, and Federal Judge Patricia Williams had all pled guilty to multiple federal charges including conspiracy, treason, and murder. Director Morrison and his brother Charles had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret Hayes and Thomas Crawford had been captured during their attempted escape to Switzerland and now faced similar sentences. But the hearing today wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding how such a massive conspiracy had operated for so long without detection. and ensuring that nothing like it could ever happen again. Ms. Miller, Senator Patricia Adams, the new chair of the Intelligence Committee, began, in your own words, please tell this committee how you first became aware that the Culinary Intelligence Unit was being used for criminal purposes rather than legitimate national security operations. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived with terrible secrets for far too long. Senator, the first indication that something was wrong came during what was supposed to be my final mission in Prague. I had been told that the target was a European Union finance minister who was planning to expose money laundering operations that threatened American interests. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the senators before settling on the cameras that would carry her words to millions of viewers around the world. When I arrived in Prague and began surveillance of the target, I discovered that he wasn't a finance minister at all. He was David Harrison, an American journalist who was investigating connections between the Pentagon and private military contractors. He was a patriot trying to expose corruption, not a threat trying to harm American interests. Agent Harrison, now promoted to Deputy Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, sat in the witness gallery watching as the woman who had helped expose the largest conspiracy in modern American history shared her story with the world. When you realized you'd been given false information about the target, Senator Adams continued, what did you do? I refused the mission, Catherine replied firmly. I told my handler that I wouldn't be part of killing an American citizen who was trying to expose government corruption. That's when I learned that the CIA didn't accept resignations from operatives who knew too much about the program's illegal activities. The attempted assassination in Prague, her survival and escape, the 15 years of careful evidence gathering. Catherine walked the committee through every step of her journey from government operative to whistleblower, her testimony providing context for the thousands of documents and recordings that had been entered into evidence. The network operated by convincing individual participants that they were serving legitimate national security interests, she explained. Most of the people involved, the culinary students, the institute faculty, even some of the government officials genuinely believed they were protecting America from foreign threats. Senator James Wilson, ranking minority member, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Ms. Miller, you're asking us to believe that a conspiracy involving dozens of high-level officials operated for 15 years without anyone in legitimate law enforcement becoming suspicious. Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Senator, the conspiracy succeeded because it was protected by people in legitimate law enforcement. Judge Williams ensured that investigations were buried. Senator Crawford used his position on this very committee to classify evidence that might have exposed the network. Deputy Secretary Torres manipulated Pentagon resources to provide cover for illegal operations. She gestured toward a chart that showed the organizational structure of the conspiracy, with lines connecting officials across all three branches of government. The network succeeded because it placed people in positions where they could control the very systems designed to detect and prevent exactly this kind of corruption. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with Catherine providing detailed testimony about every aspect of the conspiracy she had helped expose. When it finally concluded, she walked out of the Capitol building into the afternoon sunlight, where a small crowd of reporters was waiting with questions. Ms. Miller, called out Rebecca Santos from the Washington Herald, what are your plans now that this investigation is complete? Catherine smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression anyone had seen from her in months. I'm going back to cooking, she said simply. Real cooking for real people in a small restaurant where the only thing I need to worry about is whether the customers enjoy their meals. The revelation that she had purchased a small bistro in a quiet town in Vermont had surprised everyone who knew her story. After 15 years of living in the shadows and 6 months of being the most famous whistleblower in America, Catherine Miller was choosing anonymity once again. "Aren't you concerned about your safety?" asked another reporter. "The network you exposed had resources and connections around the world." "The network I exposed is in federal prison," Catherine replied. "And the evidence we gathered has been shared with law enforcement agencies in 43 countries. The days when people like Charles Morrison and Margaret Hayes could operate with impunity are over." Agent Harrison emerged from the Capitol building and approached the small press gathering. "If I may add something," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent the past 6 months dismantling one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in history. "The investigation that began with Ms. Miller's courage has resulted in the arrests of over 200 individuals across 12 countries. We've recovered stolen military technology worth over $30 billion, prevented numerous planned assassinations, and exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government." He looked directly at Catherine with obvious respect and gratitude. Without her willingness to risk everything to expose the truth, this network would still be operating today, still selling American secrets to foreign governments, still eliminating anyone who threatened their profits. But perhaps the most significant moment came when a young woman approached Catherine as the press conference was breaking up. She was in her early 20s, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "Ms. Miller," she said quietly, "my name is Jessica Harrison. David Harrison was my father." Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. The daughter of the journalist whose intended assassination had started her journey toward exposing the network was standing before her, very much alive and clearly thriving. "I wanted to thank you," Jessica continued, "not just for exposing the people who tried to kill my father, but for showing me what real courage looks like. I just graduated from journalism school, and I want to follow in his footsteps investigating corruption, holding powerful people accountable, making sure the truth comes out even when it's inconvenient for those in power." Catherine smiled through tears she hadn't expected to shed. "Your father would be very proud of you," she said. "And if you ever need advice about investigating stories that powerful people don't want told, you know where to find me." 6 months later, Catherine Miller stood in the kitchen of The Honest Plate, her small restaurant in Montpelier, Vermont, preparing dinner for 36 customers who had no idea that their chef had once been trained by the CIA to eliminate foreign targets. Her specialty was farm-to-table cuisine, featuring ingredients grown by local farmers who appreciated her commitment to honest, straightforward cooking. The restaurant had quickly developed a reputation for exceptional food served in a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Food critics from major publications had made the drive from Boston and New York to experience what one reviewer called cooking that reminds you why food matters, not as a vehicle for showing off technique, but as a way of bringing people together around something nourishing and honest. James Wellington, whose own culinary career had survived the scandal at the Monterey Institute, arrived at the restaurant on a snowy February evening. He'd driven up from Boston specifically to eat Catherine's food and to apologize for his behavior during that fateful examination 18 months earlier. "Ms. Miller," he said when Catherine emerged from the kitchen to greet her guests, "I owe you an apology that's long overdue." Catherine smiled and gestured for him to sit at a quiet corner table. "You were a young chef trying to prove yourself in a competitive environment," she said. "I don't hold grudges about professional rivalry, James." "It wasn't just professional rivalry," Wellington replied. "I was arrogant, dismissive, and cruel. I judged you based on appearances without bothering to understand who you really were." "Who I really was," Catherine said thoughtfully, "was someone who had lost herself in service to a system that had become corrupted. The woman you met that day was still learning how to be herself again." Wellington looked around the restaurant, taking in the simple decor, the obvious care that had gone into every detail, and the genuine warmth with which Catherine treated every customer. "This is who you really are," he said. Someone who uses exceptional skills to create something beautiful and nourishing for others. Catherine nodded. This is who I chose to become. Sometimes the most important question isn't who trained you, but who do you choose to be with that training? As the evening wound down and the last customers departed into the Vermont snow, Catherine stood alone in her kitchen, cleaning her knives with the same methodical precision she'd always shown. But these knives would only ever be used to create meals that brought joy and nourishment to people's lives. The ghost had finally found peace, and Catherine Miller had discovered that the most powerful way to use exceptional skills wasn't to eliminate threats to powerful people, but to create something honest and good for ordinary people who deserve nothing more than an excellent meal prepared with care and integrity. When reporters occasionally asked if she missed the excitement of her former life, Catherine would smile and point to her dining room full of families and friends enjoying food together. This, she would say, is all the excitement I need. The woman who had once been trained to kill with kitchen implements had chosen instead to use those same skills to remind people why gathering around good food was one of humanity's oldest and most important traditions. And in that choice, she had found a kind of redemption that no government medal or classified commendation could ever provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.